My name is Don Wolfensberger. I am, I used to say, director of the Congress Project, am no more, but a senior scholar here, but also president of the National Capital Area Political Science Association, and CAPSA, which, this is a town of acronyms. I was telling one of the students that we had a junior or a freshman congressman one year. He came to Washington. He was trying to learn all the acronyms, and he says, it took me 3 weeks before I realized that the door in my hallway was not another government agency. It said MEN, but anyway. But CAPSA was created in 1946 as a sort of a discussion group of folks in this area who were not just academics, but journalists, writers, and practitioners, public servants, people that worked on the Hill, worked in the executive branch, and so on. So I am one of the practitioners who is now the president. So there have been others, but it's been a real pleasure to serve in that capacity and have our members here today. The Wilson Center, on the other hand, was created in 1968, a more recent creation, and Congress enacted a law calling for a living memorial to President Woodrow Wilson, who, our 28th president, was the only president to date who has a PhD. And Wilson believed very strongly in bringing together the thinkers and the doers, the scholars and the politicians, and having an exchange of views on issues of the day. And the guy who came up with the idea of the Wilson Center, Pat Moynihan, thought that was a pretty neat idea. We should have a center dedicated to Wilson that carried out his idea of bringing together practitioners and scholars. And so we have about 800 meetings a year in these facilities where we do just that, and today you're part of one of them. I am very pleased today to have with us someone who I first started listening to way back in the early 90s, believe it or not, when I think he was a graduate student then working on one of his master's degrees at the Political Science Association meetings. And Sean really has proven to be what I spotted him as then, which is really a rising star in the political science community. And we had a chance earlier today, as I have on the last 5 years of having his annual student group meet with me to talk a little bit about the Congress. He brings about 18 of his best and brightest here every year, and so it's been a joy to have them here once again, and I welcome you to the table as well. But as you know, Sean, even though he is a not quite newly minted PhD, but I think you got your PhD in 2001, is that right, from Stanford? This is his third book, you know, and I am just still have just this one that I am proud of, but I'm thinking about a second, let's put it that way. But Sean has done some excellent work. His first book was on Congress and the people, in a way, too, on elections and how the people do influence members of Congress in various ways. His second book was on polarization in this country, and that was also very widely acclaimed and read. And now he's really extending, I think, that same research into a slightly different area, although covering a lot of the same basis, which is polarization in the Congress and partisan warfare. And this is called the Gingrich Senators, the Roots of Partisan Warfare in the Congress. So what I would like to do today is to do two things. I was not able to get a discussant or a commentator, so I'm going to wear two hats. Instead of being your usual moderate moderator that is neutral on everything, I'm going to do two things. One is to interview Sean, but then to have a little follow-up and pushback, maybe in the way of some pointed questions, some devil's advocate questions or comments to bring him out a little bit more. So I'm going to be both a moderator and a commentator in many respects, but we'll just do that for about a half hour. And then what I'd like to do is to open up the floor to you so that you can ask questions or make comments and so on. But before we do that, I just want to make two announcements. One, the Gingrich Senators is on hand, I think, at reduced price out in the atrium, and afterwards we're going to have a nice little reception where you can buy a book and have Sean sign it. And the other thing, though, I wanted to mention is that this is a wonderful read, even though it's political science. And I have a hard time hacking through a lot of political science, but I think what Sean does is to bring it to life with a lot of good anecdotes and examples that highlight what the points that he's trying to make, the theses that he's testing, and so on. But and then moving on to another hypothesis, and showing examples. And so I think it's an historical account. It's a good political account. It's got some funny things in here, as well as some serious things that should give us all cause for concern. But I would highly recommend this. To me, it was like reading, if you could have such a thing as a mystery novel in political science, this is it, because you wonder, well, how is this going to come out? What are the reasons these guys are really acting the way they are? And how did this all come about? How did this happen? So with that, having laid the groundwork, Sean, can you just tell us, first of all, how did you get the idea for a book called The Gingrich Senators, both the idea behind it, but the title as well?
Sure. So I'm going to actually take one step back, and I want to thank Don. It means a lot to me that he invited me here to have this event, mostly because I've always respected what Don does. He has a foot in political science, and he has a foot in politics. And I think that for a long time, political scientists have always viewed themselves as only being in the realm of political science. And what I love about what Don does is he makes the work that we do more accessible to the people that we're really writing for. And so it means a lot to me that he invited me in particular, and he was very keen in having this event when my students were going to be in town, because he knows how much that I rely upon them both to help me sleep at night, because I know that it takes me a long time to produce this, but when I get to interact with them and see them graduate and go off and do great things, and some of my former students are even in this room, and that's what gives me real pride. So thanks, Don, and thanks you all for coming. It's the Gingrich Senators. I was working on a book called Party Polarization in Congress, and when I started reading the literature about why Congress is so polarized, there were things that political scientists were saying. The first thing that they were saying, is redistricting. And this, we are getting a lot of this from the media and political pundits who said, it's the way that they're creating the districts. And after you do this in the 1970s and 1980s and 1990s and 2000s, in each cycle it seems as though it's getting worse and worse, where they're purposefully creating these liberal enclaves that elect liberal Democrats and these conservative enclaves that elect conservative Republicans. And that's the reason that Congress is polarizing. And I thought, all right, so let's test that. And then another strain of the literature is telling us that it's really geographic sorting. So it's the fact that people that want good coffee shops and a good art scene and good restaurants are moving all into the urban centers, and it so happens that they tend to vote Democrat. And people that care about lower taxes and safe streets and big yards are moving to other areas of the country where they have a tendency to vote for Republicans. So it really has nothing to do with explicit politics, but just the preferences that people have over their social lives that is forcing them to geographically separate into these enclaves. And I thought, all right, so that could be plausible too, and so let's study that. And then there's this other strain that said, no, it's because of the procedures that are happening inside Congress. The House leadership or the leadership is operating the institutions with much more of an iron fist, and they're allowing their members less leeway, and they're forcing them to cast party votes, and they're whipping them much more than they used to do. And I thought, that's pretty plausible. Let's look at that. And so as I was examining all these issues, I was saying, well, that explanation works for the House, but it doesn't work for the Senate. Right? So redistricting means states don't redistrict. So why is the Senate almost as polarized as the House? It's a lot easier this works much better in Texas. It's much easier for someone to move from Austin to Williamson County, which is a conservative bastion, or someone from Williamson County to move to Austin than it is to move from Texas to California. So the explanation of geographic sorting didn't work as well. And then when you look at procedures, the Senate has had pretty much the same procedures in place. And so it's an explanation that, once again, works much better for the House than it does for the Senate. And so I was left kind of at the end of that book with this puzzle, like, well, then why is the polarization almost as much in the Senate as it is in the House? And I thought about it. And so as I do when I didn't have the answer, I started turning to political pundits. And I started listening to what politicians were saying. And I listened to Barbara Sinclair, who I think is probably Don's equivalent on the political science side. So someone who has a foot inside politics, but has her degree, of course, in political science. And they were saying that there's something about the House. It's the House members in the Senate that seem to be playing this role in the Senate. And so I took them seriously, and so I started coding all the senators that had come from the House. And sure enough, when I looked at those that came from the House, they were more polarized. They were, and so I was like, all right, so that's pretty interesting. And I was like, just on a whim one day, I was like, well, I'm going to separate them into Democrats and Republicans. And when I separated them into Democrats and Republicans, lo and behold, Republicans were more conservative than the Democrats were liberal. And I thought, well, that's really interesting. And then a few days later, I said, well, I'm going to see what the relationship looks like over time. And so I go back to the 1950s and I look at House members who are coming into the Senate in 60s and 70s and 80s and 90s. And lo and behold, there's a switch right around 1980. And the switch was that the Republicans who were coming from the House into the Senate up until the 1980s or so were more moderate. And then in the 1980s, they switched and they became more conservative. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And I said, well, maybe it's because Ronald Reagan, right? So maybe there's some kind of Ronald Reagan phenomenon. He was a president that articulated a conservative message that seemed to resonate with the American public. So people who are involved in politics could proudly claim their conservative credentials, and it was an electoral strategy that had success. And so I separated out, like, all right, so those people that came of age in Reagan. And once I did that, I recognized that the senators who were coming, even in the age of Reagan, didn't look like the House members who were moving to the Senate in the age of Reagan. And so I was like, well, there's something unique about these House members. And so I started just investigating more. And of course, I remembered the book that I read that Don wrote, and I returned to that book. And I started thinking more seriously about what kind of leader Bob Michael was, who was the face of the Republican Party in the 1960s and 70s and 80s, early 80s. And then I started thinking about who Newt Gingrich was, and when he became the leader of the Republican conference in the House, and I started kind of systematically measuring these things. And lo and behold, like it's the people who come into the House during the age of Newt Gingrich that are the ones that are most responsible for this increasing polarization. And so maybe the title is a little bit too cute, but it sure encapsulates exactly what I mean about these people who are moving from the House to the Senate. And it's a heck of a lot easier than saying senators who came from the House after the 1978 election who then moved to the Senate every time. And so I have the autocorrect on my computer to this very day. When it sees GS, it changes it to Gingrich senators. So that's just an easier way to talk about those folks.
Okay. No, I think it's a catchy title, it's a cute title, and I think it's got a lot behind it. Newt Gingrich prided himself in being a partisan warrior, and you've got some good quotes from Newt in there, but I remember distinctly before we took over the majority in the House, Newt would say, I get up every morning, and I sort of gird my loins for battle. In effect, he didn't paint his face, but, he was talking about going into political battle, and that was part of the tone he set, first, as you mentioned in your book, through the Conservative Opportunity Society, through the special orders and so on, and then, his circle expanded. But you test one thing that you indicate was not a reason for these folks to be turning into Gingrich senators, and that is proximity to Gingrich. In other words, these are not necessarily acolytes. Could you play that out a little bit about what that means?
So when people hear the title Gingrich senators, they assume that there's a direct causation of Gingrich. And so I took that argument seriously, and so I looked at people that served in Newt Gingrich's whip organization. And I looked at and saw how long someone served with Newt Gingrich. And I saw if perhaps they were on the RNCC during this time period, and how long they served on the campaign committee. And every one of those factors had almost no relationship to their voting patterns. And so I thought, well, maybe it has to do with how much they like Newt Gingrich. So I look at people who would co-sponsor Newt Gingrich bills, or who Newt Gingrich would co-sponsor on their bills. And there wasn't a pattern there. And so I'm kind of left with this argument that what happens is that Newt Gingrich transforms the Republican conference in the House. And it's just by the very nature of serving in that Republican conference that's then been transformed by Newt Gingrich, that these people are socialized into politics. And that's the only kind of politics that they know about and that they learn. And then when they go to the Senate, they take that kind of socialization with them into the Senate. And they start, and they come in such great numbers in such quick succession, and the strategy is successful enough that people are seeing this, and so it kind of catches on. So instead of the lone right-wing conservative senator that might have been elected at one point, or the liberal who kind of is the lone wolf crying in the Senate, these people their troops keep growing, and they keep seeing this success, and the success feeds upon itself, and pretty soon the Republican conference in the Senate starts being transformed.
Okay. One question I have, and this isn't a trick question, but you start with folks that were elected after Newt, not concurrently with his first election in 1978. And I would think that folks that came with him in 78 were already beginning to feel the Newt effect, whether they were close to him or not, because of some of the, I don't want to say antics, but some of the behavior that he was already displaying as a backbencher. One of those people that I don't know, she was a little insulted she wasn't included, is Olympia Snowe. And you quote her a lot in here, but she was elected in 78, went on to be a senator, but she's not a Gingrich senator because she wasn't elected 2 years after Newt. Why isn't she included?
Right, why isn't she included? So there's two parts. I think that there's an institutional story in that he's transforming the way that the Republican conference operates within the institution, but I think there's also an electoral story. I think almost immediately upon Newt Gingrich coming into the House, he recognizes that he's only going to be successful if he, in turn, recruits people that think about politics in the same way that he does. And so fairly early on in his career, he even becomes the leader of GOPAC. He takes over from Governor DuPont. And I think that electoral strategy is critical. And so right, Senator Snowe is a good example, because certainly from her days in the House, I mean, we see this a little bit less in the Senate, she's very much a moderate. But she's a partisan warrior too. I mean, she's a Republican through and through. And so I like kind of the dichotomy that she sets up a little bit. And quite frankly, at the end of the day, the statistical tests reveal that the switch happens after his election. And so in order to include her, and I think there are maybe two other members who are of that class of 78, the data just didn't bear it out as clearly as they do after entering the conference after he's already in it.
Yeah, the two other members are Phil Gramm, who you do include, but only you start counting him after he switches to Republican in 83 and then is elected to the Senate in 84. You do not include Dick Shelby, who ran then for the Senate as a Democrat in 86, and I think he didn't switch to Republican until 94, right after the Republicans took over. So Phil Gramm, though, is an interesting case. He is your first Gingrich senator, the first one to be elected, and the only one to be elected, as I mentioned, in, I believe it was 84.
That's correct.
What about him did you notice when he got to the Senate that was, picking up on this theme of members taking the ways of the House to the Senate? Was there anything particular, or did you not study their particular behavior when they got there?
So taking just one step back and talking about the two of them, it was critical that they enter a Republican conference that's in the face of Newt Gingrich. So even though the two of them were elected in 1978, they weren't elected into a Republican conference. And so by the time they get into the Republican conference, of course, Phil Gramm does so in the House. And so my argument would be that he becomes socialized, even if it's just for a year, in the House Republican Conference. But Shelby doesn't do so until he gets to the Senate. And so I would think the socialization effect of Gingrichization.
You can coin any word you want. You're the author.
Is less direct because he switches to the Republican Conference in the Senate. So in terms of Phil Gramm is... I think that Phil Gramm fits the mold. He's a little bit different in that he is a little bit more willing to work with Democrats across the aisle. Of course, you have the Graham Redmond Hollings, where he worked across the aisle. But nonetheless, I think that he is a good first face of the Gingrich senators, and I think that his early career kind of typifies that.
Okay. John McCain is the second. He was elected, in 86?
That's right.
Second one to come to the Senate. And yet, over time, he was perceived as more of a maverick and a moderate. Does he fit the Gingrich mold when he gets to the Senate?
So during the writing of this book, I've had a love-hate relationship with John McCain, because there are points where he...
A lot of people have, I think.
And I bet there's a strong correlation between who's loving and who's hating. But there are times where John McCain destroys the image of what I would call a Gingrich senator, where he goes to Ted Kennedy's funeral, where he's willing to talk to Democrats and trying to come up with pragmatic solutions to problems. But there are other times where his behavior is very much a partisan warrior. When he signs off of being a co-sponsor on the bipartisan budget commission, I think is an example of that. Even after, understandably so, after the 2008 election, certainly the John McCain that went back into the Senate was operating a little bit differently than he was as being the maverick, go-along, get-along senator that he might have been before that, co-sponsoring legislation with Russ Feingold and working with Democrats.
Okay. But then we get into other members who came to the House before they went to the Senate after Newt stepped down as Speaker, and yet the one that you mentioned most prominently that has had a big effect on the Senate is Jim DeMint. How do you classify him as a Gingrich senator when he really didn't know Gingrich directly, didn't operate under his speakership or any of that nature? Why do you still count these folks as Gingrich senators?
Right. And the reason I do is just going back to the socialization. So the Republican conference that Jim DeMint enters in 1998 is very much the Republican conference in the image of Gingrich, even if he isn't the head of the conference anymore. The conference that DeMint enters is one that has all guns blazing in partisan warfare. And so even though Newt Gingrich isn't around in the House to serve as the mentor to the folks 1998 and after, the Republican conference that they all enter is still, I would argue, in the face of Newt Gingrich and in kind of the antithesis of Bob Michael's go along to get along Republican conference.
Okay. And my final question before we open it up is taking Jim DeMint as sort of, I don't want to say John the Baptist, but sort of the transition or bridge to the Tea Party movement. You don't call the Tea Party folks this, but it's almost like, the second, or you call them the descendants of the Gingrich senators. I would call them Star Trek: The Next Generation. But in any event, could you tell us a little bit about the role that he has played with those that have come up with him and after him in the Tea Party, which most of those folks did not come through the House, and yet they are instantly transitioned or transformed into Gingrich-type senators in the Senate? Is that because the Senate culture is already so entrenched in the mold of the Gingrich House that they walked into it, or would they have been like that anyway?
Well, I think that they probably would have been like that anyway, but the fact that they get to enter the Senate is because I think that the Gingrich senators open the door to partisan warfare, and the Tea Party senators are the ones racing through it. And so the tactics, I think, that the Gingrich senators use because of the pervasive of their use and because of the longevity of their use, I think they become legitimate in the eyes of the public. And so then when the Tea Party senators come along and say, yeah, we're going to use those tactics plus these, it makes them quite not the next, I can't remember what
You said the descendants.
Right,
yes.
No, but what did you say?
I said Star Trek: The Next Generation.
Right, the next generation. So that's the reason I think that they become the descendants rather than the next generation. But I think Jim DeMint is critical in anointing these folks. I think that without Jim DeMint's blessing, I'm not sure you would have seen the donations to these folks in some pretty competitive, tough primaries. And I think that his support ultimately becomes crucial to their nomination. And then when they get to the Senate, of course, they have no type of loyalty to the Republican Party because, in fact, many of them won the Republican primaries over the Republican establishment, but they have tremendous amount of loyalty to Jim DeMint because it was him breaking with the Republican establishment that ultimately led to their primary success and their entry into the Senate.
So if he is sort of the de facto leader of the Tea Party folks, even though he wasn't one himself to begin with, why did he step down last year and decide to go to Heritage? What was the reason he gave? Could you explain a little bit about that and how you think that's going to impact the future of the Tea Party folks and others that come to the Senate?
Right, so you have to understand that I'm sitting on a manuscript where Jim DeMint plays a pretty critical role, and then he makes this decision. And I was actually in Washington, D.C. on the day that he's making the decision. I'm reading my phone. I was like, oh, my God, what's going to happen to this book? Jim DeMint is so critical. and I think that we see where I might be headed for book number 4.
I was wondering.
And I thought, uh-oh, there goes that idea too. But I think at the end of the day, Jim DeMint recognized that it was a long road that he was going to have to travel to transform, to make the Republican conference in the Senate to the degree that he wanted it to be. I think that his ranks are right now, let's call it 8, perhaps 9 if we include Scott, and I certainly think we should include Senator Scott in that group. But it's probably easy for them to get to 12 or 13. It's going to be really, really hard for them to get up to 20. And so I thought that he could never, he could certainly influence the Senate. He was never going to become the Republican face of the Senate. And you all, right, many people in this room probably know Jim DeMint a heck of a lot better than I do. But I suspect that at the end of the day, the guy has never been a particularly rich fellow. And certainly his new job allows him access to a little bit more money and a little bit more freedom. And so I think that he recognized.
Explain exactly what he's doing now.
Right. So he's president of the Heritage Foundation, which at first looks like it could be a great fit. But of course, Heritage certainly comes at these things from not entirely the same angle that Jim DeMint would. And so I think Heritage over the last few years perhaps has been. Their visibility has gone down a little bit, and so I wondered if they in part weren't perhaps banking on a strategy of gaining their visibility a little bit more and bringing in this guy that certainly knows how to attract a TV camera and knows how to make an argument and can certainly give a good speech that would certainly resonate with enough of their supporters.
But I think you make the point, and I don't think I'm confusing this with something else I read recently, but the two groups that the members of the House, at least, are now paying a lot of attention to, and I suspect the Gingrich and Tea Party senators are too, are Heritage Action, which is the action arm of the Heritage Foundation, and the Club for Growth, that have a lot to do with raising money and supporting candidates even who are running against incumbent Republicans. Is that what you are seeing as maybe one of the reasons that he's going there? You had the quote in your book about DeMint saying, the reason I'm leaving the Senate is because it's too difficult to change it from the inside, and therefore I'm going to change it from the outside.
Right. Not only I'm not going to be able to change the Republican senators that are already there. It's going to be far easy for me to replace those Republican senators with people who think a little bit more about politics in the way that I do. That's
okay.
True.
Well, let's open up the floor, and please wait for a microphone, and then give your name and affiliation, and feel free to ask a question or make a brief comment. Saw a hand back there, first of all.
Hi, David Gartner with Arizona State. Really interesting and provocative thesis. I wanted to just ask you about some possible alternative explanations. So instead of the Gingrich senators, why aren't they the Grover Norquist senators? In other words, the rise of groups that can enforce pledges and that sort of thing in primaries driving this rather than sort of Gingrich, who maybe benefited from it to some degree. Or alternatively, why isn't this just a product of regional sorting? Looking at your chart on the back of the one-pager here, it really is the Sun Belt senators who kind of echo this, at least on the ideology spectrum. People like DeWine, people like Kirk and others from the northern tier don't seem, at least on the ideological side, to play out. And so to what degree is this just the New England vestige of the Republican Party becoming extinct and the southern vestige of the Democratic Party becoming extinct?
Great. So first, David, I want to thank you for coming all the way from Arizona for this presentation this evening. I appreciate your perseverance. That's good. And that's the best endorsement
Another
yet.
plug, yeah.
So to take those in order, and I have different answers to both, but I think they're consistent with the overall argument in the book. First, the Grover-Norquist senators. I think that quite simply, it's that they predate Grover. So I think that certainly Grover Norquist works for the Senate that we're looking at today. But if we go back to the even late 1980s and early 1990s, and about the time that Bill Clinton's elected president and Newt Gingrich becoming speaker, I'm not sure that Grover was on too many people's radar screens there. I mean, certainly he was a player in Washington, but I don't think that he was a player outside of Washington nearly to the extent that he is today. And so it's simply an argument of longevity. And I think that certainly Grover feeds the mentality of the Gingrich senators. And so I would just simply say that kind of just out of proximity and being first, I like Gingrich senators better. And I think Newt would agree with me that Gingrich
I think he'd be
is
flattered, actually.
is a far better term. And then you're right about the regional sorting. It's funny. When George Voinovich was asked what the problem with the Senate was, he said there are too many senators from the South, like Jim DeMint and Tom Coburn. And I said, well, you got the right names, but you have the wrong explanation. It's the fact that they're Gingrich senators, not the fact that they're from the South. Because even when I control for the states that these folks come from, the partisanship of the states that they come from, it certainly has an effect on how they vote and how they act in the Senate. But the effect is about 15%. So there's definitely a regional in constituency component, but even with that 15%, their behavior is still off the charts. And I think one of the best kind of piece of evidence that I can provide for that is there's a table early on in the book where I look at where there are two Republicans representing a particular state, and one of them is a Gingrich senator and one of them is a what I call other Republican. In every one of those, not every one, in 90% of those instances, the Gingrich senator is more conservative. And so even when we look at conservative states, it plays out. I mean, an obvious case here is Arlen Specter versus Rick Santorum. But in just about every state that I've given my presentation on the Gingrich senators, it works. So I gave a presentation in Indiana, and so I replaced that slide with the slide of Dan Coates and Dick Lugar, and it works. And so
I just got to mention a little anecdote here that ties in with what you were saying. When I sent this invitation out to various folks for this book launch, one of those was an old friend, I won't name names, who had worked in the Senate for many years prior to this influx, and then during the influx of new folks from the House. He wrote back and said, "Good premise for this book." He says, I agree. We had a saying in the Senate, oh no, here comes another one of those nuts from the House. And so I wrote back to him showing the difference between the House and Senate attitudes. I said, well, in the House we had a saying that whenever one of the House members was elected to the Senate, he just raised the IQ level of both bodies.
Spoken
yes.
like a true House man.
Jordan Tama.
Hi, Jordan Tama. I teach at American University. A couple questions for you related to each other. One, you mentioned the idea or possibility that this could be influenced by Ronald Reagan and his rise. Since he was elected president soon after Gingrich came to the House, how do you dismiss the possibility that the Republicans in Congress were kind of emboldened by him or inspired by him to be more conservative as they moved over to the Senate? And then also, do you find any evidence of a change in behavior after the Republicans take control of Congress in 1994? I could imagine that they could have been emboldened to, be more conservative based on the idea that they had been successful in that election. Is there any evidence of that?
So before I answer your questions, I want to thank you for coming all the way from the American University in Egypt, coming even farther than Arizona. Ronald Reagan, the way that I separate it is I look at senators who are elected after 1980, and those who came from the House and those that didn't come from the House. And lo and behold, those that don't come from the House after 1980 are a good bit more moderate than those coming from the House. And I think that's a pretty good test of the Reagan phenomenon. And then 1994, that's a really interesting question because I think, so I'm going to take a stab at this in two different directions. The first one is 1994 is the crowning achievement of the Gingrich strategy. It's something that he'd been talking about since he showed up in 1978 and finally said, see, I was right. If we show a different face to the public, then they're going to be able to distinguish the Democrats from the Republicans in a way that's going to be advantageous for us. And so it was vindication of a strategy that then, of course, just feeds on itself even more. But I think that there's a slighting kind of cutting of that emboldening strategy, and that's the Gingrich senators, especially when it comes to partisan warfare, less than party polarization. And maybe I'll just take a second and explain. So for a long time, we've been talking about party polarization. And part of my argument in this book is that there's an entirely separate dimension about partisan warfare. There are people who are very conservative, but not necessarily partisan warriors. And there are people who are pretty moderate. And actually, Rick Santorum is one of these guys. If you look at his voting record, it's moderate. I mean, it's a little bit to the right of the average Republican. But when you look at partisan warriorship, I mean, he's off the charts. And what we find, especially with respect to partisan warfare, is that Republicans, when they're in the majority, the Gingrich senators act a whole lot like the other Republicans. But it's when they're in the minority that they're kind of gunning, because now they're the minority party, so they have nothing to lose if they kind of blow up the process. But as long as they're part of the majority, then I think that they're like, all right, so here's our chance. And I think that with that subtlety of the majority party, I think that's where you're going to see a distinction between the Gingrich senators and the Tea Party senators, because I think that they don't much care about being in the majority.
One of the things that comes to me is that I talked to somebody who had been on both the House and the Senate Republican leadership, and they had looked over your book, and they thought it was quite good, but that you overlooked the impact of ideas on the change in the Republican Party. And I think what he had in mind is this, and I'll just use this example. He didn't mention it, but I remember it very vividly, and that was in 1980, after Reagan got the nomination. Gingrich persuaded, and keep in mind, he was still a relative backbencher, he persuaded the Republican leadership in the House to have an event on the Capitol steps with Reagan, spelling out the three main platforms of the Reagan campaign. That's lower taxes, better, stronger defense, and something else, and reduce government. But and Reagan did that, and it was sort of the run-up to what we saw in '94 with the contract with America. But we also saw about the same time, I think, what this leadership aide was telling me, and that is the rise of the Kemp folks and their idea on dynamic scoring and opportunity and growth in the economy and so on. So there was a revolution of ideas taking place there that had more to do with what's going on than partisan warfare or anything else, it seems to me, and that was something that this person wanted to emphasize. So I am sort of exercising a proxy for that person.
That's great. So one of my most valuable mentors at the University of Texas is Brian Jones, someone who cares very much about kind of the politics of ideas and public policy and appreciating the differences between how Congress deals with issues on agriculture and armed services, and there's an important argument to be made. And unfortunately, like, this book was big enough for me, but I could very much imagine kind of that being a next step too, is looking at the differences in how the Gingrich senators act on all these different sub policy areas, and I think that would be a great test of it. Mm-hmm. Like, is their behavior much different on economics than it is on agriculture, as it is on armed services? And if it is, then I think it would undercut the idea of arguments or of the revolution of ideas. But lo and behold, if we do see distinction in policy areas and we see that it's focused mostly on taxes and economic issues, then I think that it would be a full endorsement. Mm-hmm. Up till now, the analysis I've done, I just can't separate that out right now.
Well, you've done an excellent analysis. We have plenty of time left, so question over here from Ken.
Hi, Ken Cotto, House History Office. Given that you're talking about socialization into becoming party warriors, how many of these Gingrich senators didn't have political backgrounds in legislative office, or did they, or were their legislatures particularly amateur?
Before they came to the House.
Before they came to the House, or were they from legislatures that only met 3 months out of the year?
Yeah, that's a great. So, Ken, you've heard me present this argument before. I wish that you had mentioned it before the book came out.
More homework for you.
No, that's right. Because what I do in the book is I look at all sorts of personal characteristics that might help explain this. And so I look at someone's religion. I look and see if they were served in the military. I even go so far as to see if they were in a fraternity when they were in college. In each one of those contributes a tiny little bit to the explanation, but overall it doesn't. In fact, once you include all of those separate variables in the analysis, the effect of being a Gingrich senator only grows. So once we control for those things, which have a margin, a small effect, the argument becomes stronger. One of the things that I didn't do was look at their previous background, and I should. And I'm now thinking of some of the stories that I tell, and their. I'm thinking of a lot of the cases in that argument has some credibility. Like it's something I can clearly look at pretty quickly, and I'll get you an answer.
One thing that Trent Lott mentioned at one of our forums that we had last year, and somebody asked, well, what about these Tea Party folks that are bomb throwers and they won't compromise anything and they don't want government to do anything and so on? He said, don't worry. He says, they'll settle down. I've been through this before with other new classes that come about and so on. But I really wonder, because there is so little previous electoral experience on their part, what if they did just come to town to shut things down, or they don't want government to do anything? Why is there going to be any incentive for them to start working with others to get things done when they don't really have in mind getting anything done?
It's fascinating. People, for lots of different reasons, are fascinated by Texas and American politics, and certainly the phenomenon of Ted Cruz has not reduced people's interest in what happens, what's in our water in the state of Texas. So I've talked to lots of reporters who've wanted to try and understand this Ted Cruz phenomenon. And I say, everything that you're saying about all the horrible things that he's doing up in Washington, it only plays to his benefit in Texas. I mean, he's doing exactly what he said he was going to do, right? If the Washington reporters could have voted in that election, David Dewhurst would have won the Republican primary, and David Dewhurst would have come and been someone very much like John Cornyn. I mean, cast pretty similar votes. He would have been institutionalist. But the Republican voters in the state of Texas had a decision, and they voted overwhelmingly that they wanted someone that was going to come and shut the process down. We can't be surprised that that's what he's done since he's gotten here.
Okay. Okay, yes, back there in the corner.
Hi. I'm sorry I got in a little bit late. Congratulations, first of all.
Identify yourself, David.
I have ID. Sign up. David Carroll, University of Maryland. First of all, congratulations, Sean. I haven't read this yet, but I know the article that preceded it and previous book, so I'm sure it's thorough and well informed. And one thing that you do very carefully is you try and control for everything. You try and take advantage of these tests and natural experiments, things like 2 Republican senators from the same state. And I do that kind of thing too, so I appreciate that. So that's hard to argue with, that, look, it just seems to be some of these guys' experience, everything about them, I control for everything you can think of. But at the same time, polarization has been happening in so many other aspects of our politics. It happened in national party platforms. It happens in the presidency. It happens in judicial clerk selection. There are studies showing that now. In state legislatures, there's polarization. So that suggests that there's some broader, and in state legislatures where there isn't it's not sorting because people are still from Ohio or still from California. Maybe there's a little regional sorting in those states, but so it seems like there's some larger social forces at work, and I just want to get your reaction on that.
Sure. And so, David, it's great to see you here. David, I was lucky enough to have David be a reviewer of my book, my second book. If the people who are reviewing the third book have listened to me at all, I keep telling them to send you this book to review too. So I appreciate that. So the broader, larger social forces, the Senate was supposed to be immune to those, right? The existence of the filibuster, the long institutional tradition of the Senate was that you were Senate men first, you were members of a political party second, that you would turn a common face even to the president who wanted things, that you were not going to be the president's lackey. And so part of this, the reason I think that we needed the Gingrich senators is because we needed to understand why it was that the Senate has fallen into that those broader forces. And so I think that I would kind of recast your question in that light and suggest that this is my explanation for why the Senate has finally caught up, because it finally couldn't withstand the broader social pressures. And certainly Newt Gingrich understood that better than anyone. And so the politics that he's practiced quickly becomes resonated in the folks who moved to the Senate.
Let's bring it over here and do Monty Tripp. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, Jonathan Ladd from Georgetown. So I know you, like, every question is an alternative explanation that you can then respond to and knock down. So
That's why there's a book instead of an article.
so that's just a warning to say this is another one. So so I see that you have this finding, right? That I don't dispute the right that the in the modern era, the people coming through the House behave differently than the people coming through than people getting elected directly to the Senate, right? They behave differently. Now, could it be that, as David was saying, that the big thing that happened around 78 and 80, right? It's Gingrich getting elected and Reagan getting elected, but Gingrich's unique personality, but beyond that, right? It's not those personalities, right? It's the interest group and activist base of the Republican Party changes, right? And changes at the grassroots, right? And so the sort of groups that at the very local level are running local Republican Party organizations and that are voting in Republican primaries are different, the people and the groups, right? So could it be that the sort of people who run for Congress, right, they have to compete in district level primaries, and so they have to appeal to those electorates, plus the people who are likely to run are likely to be from those party organizations, right? So is it likely that it's the sort of people that run and go through the House and get elected to the House are different than the people who go into the Senate from some other way, in the sense that they're more directly from the activist base and the interest group base of the party that changes. So it is that, but it's something else beyond the socialization, right? In that they're responding more to this grassroots pressure because they have that experience.
That's interesting. Thinking about the double primary effect of Gingrich senators. So maybe I'll add to your argument, which ultimately could be a criticism then of the book, in that it's almost like surviving the Republican primary in these House districts legitimizes them as politicians in a way that people who run for the Senate that don't have that experience have to almost rely upon being a bit more moderate or something.
Yeah, well, I think it's partially having to respond to the primary electorate,
right?
And partially they're more likely to be the four people who are voting in the primary electorate. They're likely to be the activists,
right?
And I haven't looked as closely as you at the sort of people who go into the Senate without going through the House.
Right.
How many of them are governors? How many of them haven't held elective office? What are those folks like as the comparison?
And so
group?
that's who I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of the previous careers of what I call the other Republicans. So I think of Mike Johann, certainly conservative, not as conservative as you think he would be given that he's from Nebraska. I'm thinking of Bob Corker, who has to survive a Republican primary to become mayor of Chattanooga, a Republican city. But certainly Bob Corker is much more moderate than you would expect perhaps someone from Tennessee to be. Perhaps I'm cherry picking. I'm thinking of George Voinovich, governor of Ohio, who comes in. I guess that you'd have to be a certain amount of moderation to survive the Republican primary and then a general election, become governor of Ohio. But so perhaps maybe I am cherry picking, but I think that I think there is something about the socialization, right? But I'm thinking of Ken's argument. Maybe that same socialization is happening in state legislatures, and so maybe it's not enough that you're a chief executive, because being a chief executive forces you to work across the aisle in such a way that it's going to socialize you in a different type of politics than being in a legislature. And so maybe the state legislatures is where I should be looking instead of. But it's interesting. But what I'll say is your larger argument about it, it's the activists of the grassroots, and it's the broader interest group environment. Certainly you'd think that would have the same effect on both those that came from the House and those that didn't come from the House, and to the extent we see this really distinct behavior pattern of those only coming from the House. And of course there are folks that should be Gingrich senators because they certainly act like Gingrich senators that aren't Gingrich senators, and I think of Jeff Sessions as being the most obvious example. And there are some Gingrich senators who aren't very Gingrich-y, if you will. But nonetheless, that broad pattern just stands up to statistical test over statistical test over statistical test that at some point I throw my hands up and say it is Gingrich. It's the House, serving in the House, the socialization that you get from being in the Republican conference in the House during this highly partisan era.
Monty Tripp.
Monty Tripp with ABB. Let's compare the House Republicans, the Gingrich senators, to what's happening with Democrats in the House. Certainly Nancy Pelosi is as fierce a partisan and no holds bar liberal as you will find. Yet you don't see this kind of transition and translation in the Democratic Party in the House or the Senate. Why?
So I think that there are two different explanations, and you all tell me if it's enough to explain it. The first is that that in order, I think the deck is stacked against Democrats in trying to get elected to the Senate because the smaller states are just more conservative, and so for Democrats to survive in those more conservative states, they have to be moderate, and so it's just harder. So we have more Democrats now serving in the Senate coming from red states than we do Republicans coming from blue states. And if that equation were flipped, then maybe the phenomenon that I observe wouldn't be true. So I think part of it is just the way that elections happen, and it forces Democrats. And I'm thinking here of Donnelly from Indiana. If he were a Pelosi Democrat, he wouldn't have won. And so the fact that he's in the Senate today is a testament to his moderation. And the second argument, and this is a more philosophical or ideological argument, and that's that and I'm still trying to figure out how I want to talk about this, but at the end of the day, the Democrats, even when they're in the minority, they're still the party of government. They still believe in government solutions. They still think that the government has to solve problems. And at the end of the day, Republicans, by and large, think that the solution can be found outside of government. And so they're fine throwing a wrench in the system and having the system become dysfunctional because at the end of the day, maybe if the government does less, that's ultimately going to be good. But Democrats, if they start buying into that throwing a wrench in the system, let's stop it, like it just hurts their ideology of government solutions. And so I think they're just less willing to go there because at the end of the day, they want the government to solve problems.
John Forty.
John Fortier at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So first, let me tell you a quick George Voinovich anecdote, which may show that he's closer to your position than you think. He said, oh, there were too many Southerners coming in. Well, it is one of his very last talks before he left the Senate. I think it was at the Aspen Institute. Somebody asked him, well, what's wrong with the Senate? What's the one thing you would do to fix it? He said, fewer House members. So he didn't say fewer Gingrich senators, but he did say fewer House members. So it was sort of a similar thought. There are obviously a lot of very smart people in the room who've asked many of the things I was thinking about. One thing I wanted to play off, though, was, David Carroll mentioned broadly these changes in polarization. I guess I wanted to, I think the thrust of the book is exactly right from broad perspective, but also from the reactions of newly elected senators and people I know have worked for them and examples of this. But one thing I think might be true is, yes, our whole system has become more polarized, and that is, but before it was polarized, it masked many of the differences between the House and the Senate, right? The House is much more clearly a majoritarian body today because the parties are unified and they can work their will, and they can work their will in the minority and stick together, and that translates into things like, having much more popular control over who becomes chairman of committees, where the House used to be much more reliant on seniority, and so the differences between the House and the Senate and their rules seem much more evident today than they did 30 years ago, and that seems consistent with some of the actions of these new senators that come in. Examples like, hey, we should challenge Olympia Snowe to see who's chairman of this committee, and knowing sort of older Senate hands working for this person said, well, you don't do that here. But the majoritarian culture of the House, can you separate that out? I mean, it's hard to measure, but do you have that sense too that we have much more kind of majoritarians, and you might see that on the Democratic side too, with a lot of the new Democrats coming in being much more against the filibuster, much more sort of in their bones that is the majoritarian culture of the House is really what should be transported into the Senate.
Right. So I think that your observation is correct, and it certainly rings true with what I think is true, or how I look at politics. But what we don't find is that the Democrats coming from the House act much differently than other Democrats do. And so you just don't see it. And maybe this is a little bit an answer to my question to Monty, that it was that they can't be because of the states that they come from, where Republicans are given more license because there are more of them coming from more conservative states. So in order for it to be the majoritarian mindset of the House, I think that you need to see the same phenomenon among Democrats, and you don't.
Yes. Ken, you have a follow-up question.
No.
The House Historian's Office always gets priority.
Really? Great.
Today.
Actually, this one was in terms of what the next step is, because it strikes me a socialization theory can help explain things like how the Republicans go from civil rights to much more of a conservative party in civil rights. That it could help explain historically the impact of certain events, such as nonpartisan primaries. Would that have had an impact? Because different members are coming in, they're being socialized differently. And I'm wondering whether you were thinking in terms of extending it in terms of time, other cases. I guess the one I'm thinking about now would be the New Deal, the impact of the Great Depression and the success of the New Deal. What impact did that have on Democratic members coming in and Republican members who are hanging on by their fingernails?
Right. So I have two stabs at this question. The first one is that Dave Rohde, who collaborated on the article that David Carroll referred to earlier, that kind of helped launch this book. So he's very much kind of thinking about mandate elections in the longevity of what happens during those mandate elections. And I think kind of his thinking about the importance of cohorts in the year they're elected and how long they stay and how distinct they are is important in understanding how the institution evolves. And so I think that very well could be the next project that gets me excited. And the second thing that I would say is I can't believe that Gingrich is such a unique individual that this is strictly bound to this institution because of this man in this time period. And so I would love if tracing back we can see this phenomenon happening cyclically and have a much broader explanation for understanding politics as it's played out and evolved, not only the last 30 years, but perhaps the last 130 years.
See, that question wasn't so bad.
No.
Yeah. I guess in closing, I would just make an observation that the title Gingrich Senators in some ways rings true, in some ways not, in that we had two different Gingriches. One was the Gingrich who was the backbencher bomb thrower that was still looked to by moderates to find a new way to get Republicans to a majority they hadn't held for 40 years. And that was the pattern that I think you're talking about when you're talking about partisan warfare and some of the tactics that were used then. But then we have the Gingrich as speaker who left, I don't want to say so much in disgrace, but he was about to lose if he had run for speaker a third time because his followers, so-called followers, thought that he had sold out, that he was too much of a pragmatist in trying to get government back running after the shutdown and so on, of buying their way out of town with earmarks, things of that nature. So he wasn't so much transformative as he was, to me, a pragmatic politician that was trying to exercise leadership to get some things done at least. Would you want to comment at all on that aspect of his leadership versus his earlier career?
Right, and I think that once again we're going back to that key election of 1994. So he says, all right, we're now in the majority. Like we're vindicated, but now like we're finally controlling the lever, so let's do something with it. And so let's figure out a way to make the system work because finally we're driving the car. But yeah, the face of the Republican conference was like, no, we throw bombs. That's what we do. So he was successful in the strategy, and they become a majority, and they still wanted to act as though they were a minority. And he's like, no, we're in the majority. And so there just became a disconnect between what you should do as being in the majority party. I mean, no doubt, had they lost in 1998 and they could have gone back to the minority party tactics, that there wouldn't have been that disconnect. Mm-hmm. He would have lost the election for leader.
Well, thank you so much for that, and please join me in thanking him and join us for a reception outside the door here.
Thank you all for coming.
Great job.
Thanks, John. That was fun.
And for a book sale and signing.
Yeah, that's right.